Ukraine says it's in danger of losing the war, and Russia is more confident of victory than ever. And here's one of the biggest reasons: oil, Russia's most important and most enduring weapon. The country raked in at least $218 billion from oil in 2022, and that's why Western leaders made it the main target of their sanctions against Moscow. The oil price cap is the West's most important sanction. It was designed to keep Russian oil flowing to the global market, whilst also limiting the amount of money the Kremlin could make from it. For a while it worked, not anymore. When the price cap was introduced, it had a clear impact on the price Russia got for its oil. But for almost 6 months now, Russian oil has been sold on global markets well above the price cap of $60, the rate at which G7 states cut off access to their services.
The first half of 2023, Putin really suffered from oil price cap. Now he learned how to circumvent it.
In this episode, we look at how Russia rejuvenated its oil revenues, and we'll consider what options Ukraine and its allies have to hit back.
There's a kind of a sense of urgency to make some adjustments to the sanctions regime now to make sure that pressure on Russia is maintained.
As the war drags on, questions are being asked of how long both sides can fund the fight. There are doubts over how long Western support for Ukraine will last, and Russia is ramping up military spending.
The huge increase in budget spending for war next year, we're talking about going from 4% of GDP to 6% of GDP. This is a lot. This is a lot.
How long Russia can sustain this war? Unfortunately, for an extended period of time.
Welcome to Business Beyond. Let's go back a little bit. After the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the US, the EU and the other Western powers introduced a range of sanctions which mostly targeted Russia's financial system. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian central bank reserves held abroad were frozen, while the country was also excluded from the SWIFT international payments system.
These sanctions are designed to take a heavy toll on the Kremlin's interests and their ability to finance war.
The Russian economy weathered those better than many experts expected it to, but they still had an effect.
So imagine the world without sanctions. So reserves are not frozen. Putin has full access to Western military technology or dual-purpose technology. Putin can trade with whoever he wants. So if you think about this world, I guess the outcome of the war on the battlefield in Ukraine would have been very different in favor of Putin.
The EU was slow to target Russian gas and oil early on, mostly because its own economy was so reliant on it. Part of the reason the Kremlin made so much money in 2022. Late last year, the EU finally took action on Russian oil, along with countries from the G7 and Australia. That was with the introduction of something which we've mentioned already and which you're going to hear a lot more about in this episode: the price cap.
The EU decided that it was going to implement its embargo on Russian oil and petroleum products. And part of that embargo was also a prohibition for European service providers to participate in the trade with Russian oil. And this would be, for instance, shipping companies and maritime insurance companies.
But energy prices soared throughout 2022, and there were concerns that an embargo could push them up again, which would defeat the purpose of the sanction.
Out of this concern resulted the concept of the price cap, which is really a very complex intervention into global oil markets. And the basic idea is that this provision of the embargo that would have prohibited European companies from participating was rolled back as long as the oil was sold under a certain threshold, which was later set at $60 per barrel.
The oil price cap aims to keep Russian oil on the global market, but also aims to limit the price it can be sold for. Companies from the EU or G7 countries can provide services such as insurance for the transit of Russian oil, but only if it is shown that the oil was traded for no more than $60 per barrel, well below average global oil prices. It was an unusual and somewhat daring intervention, but in the first few months, it worked like a charm. The cap had an immediate impact on revenues. In the first 6 months of 2023, Russia took in 47% less in oil revenues than it did in the first 6 months of 2022. In April alone, revenues were 67% down year on year.
Broadly speaking, the energy sanctions regime had the desired impact. We know that Russian oil remained on the market. Prices did not rise until at least the OPEC Plus production cuts later in the year. And Russian export earnings fell sharply, we think, by about 30% year to date, and budget revenues from oil declined by something between 35 and 40%.
But even before the cap was introduced, Russia was working on ways to get around it. One of the main ways is through its so-called shadow fleet.
Russia's ability to ship oil on vessels that are essentially sanctions-proof. So this is what is often talked about as the shadow fleet. It's a bit of a question what exactly constitutes a shadow fleet vessel, but it essentially means Russia's ability to use ships that are not owned by an entity in the G7 or EU, and that is not insured by an entity in these jurisdictions. And then the price cap doesn't apply.
Russia has amassed a fleet of hundreds of often aging tankers to move its oil around the world without being subject to the cap. They typically have complex ownership structures. Many operate without proper insurance, and they use various methods to avoid detection, including creating fake location signals. Being able to sell oil without abiding by the cap means Russia is now getting close to average global prices per barrel.
The mechanism through which it worked seems to be losing some steam. So this mechanism is the spread between global prices and prices for Russian oil, in particular Urals crude oil, which is what is exported from Russia's ports in the Baltic Sea and Black Sea to markets originally in Europe and now increasingly to India. This spread was about $40 per barrel in January. It has now come down to around $15 per barrel.
It's not only the shadow fleet that helps Russia beat sanctions. There's also the problem known as attestation fraud. That's where paperwork is falsified to fool G7 shipping service providers into thinking that the cargo is compliant with the price cap, when in reality it has been sold at rates far above it.
We see many kind of new entities, a lot of them Dubai-based, that are now trading Russian oil, and these are suspected also to be linked to Russian oil companies. And these are the companies that are providing the pricing information. We believe that some of this pricing information was falsified.
Experts say Russia barely sells any oil below the price cap anymore and goes to considerable expense to evade it.
It costs money. Shadow tanker fleet costs money. Transportation cost is higher. Still, if you look at the data from July, August, September 2023, already it looks like Russia is doing okay. And if you compare the third quarter 2023 to third quarter 2022, the difference is much, much smaller.
The data for the last few months does indeed confirm just how much Russia's efforts have worked. From July to October this year, Russian oil revenues exceeded those of the same period last year by 34%. In October, the country took in a massive $16.6 billion from its oil revenues alone, a more than 50% increase on the same month last year and the most of any month since April 2022. Finding ways to beat the oil price cap was pretty tricky for Russia, for a while at least, but finding buyers was much easier. Two countries stand out when it comes to Russia's post-invasion economic order: China and India. Their willingness to trade with the sanctioned regime has seriously helped Russia maintain some kind of economic stability and in turn propel its war effort.
China now gets just under 20% of its oil from Russia. But that's been an increasing trend. I think before the war it was about 15%, so it was a modest increase. For India began with about 1% and now it's more than 20%. So that was a huge change.
China's growing geopolitical partnership with Russia meant stepping up trade relations was an easy decision for Beijing.
Russia's a strategic partner, so China was trying to help Russia in this situation, but also to benefit from any deals that might be available. I don't know that this was completely an altruistic effort by China to backstop the Russian economy, but I think China saw it as an opportunity to increase economic ties with Russia, which had always been a weak point in their partnership.
While China has gradually increased the amount of oil it imports from Russia, it has also become especially important for Moscow as a technological partner, particularly for semiconductors. Such products are called dual purpose, in that they are vital for military production, but also have other uses.
Where China is playing a huge role is when it comes to Russia's ability to buy certain things it needs for its military production. So these are the kind of Western components that we're talking about that are now largely routed to China on its way to Russia.
Semiconductors, for example, can be used in a variety of technologies that have military applications, but also things like heavy trucks that are needed on the battlefield and are not on the surface a weapon, but they are certainly used in the battle, in the battle space in Ukraine.
China has not sold weapons to Russia. Doing so would result in heavy sanctions. But expanding trade with Moscow, as India has done, has helped the Kremlin fund its war. 2024 is a critical year for Ukraine. Its counter-offensive in 2023 did not yield the results that its allies had hoped for. And the sense that Russia had lost momentum, very apparent in the early months of this year as the sanctions hit, has passed. There are also serious doubts about how long Western support for Ukraine will last. The possible return of Donald Trump as US president is just one reason, given his previous closeness with Putin.
It's great to be with you.
Another is the new conflict in the Middle East, which has diverted attention from Ukraine. Meanwhile, Moscow has announced it will ramp up defense spending next year as part of a record budget of nearly $380 billion. Much of that huge 25% hike will go towards defense spending. In fact, defense and security will comprise a massive 40% of the total budget.
For Putin, the priorities are war and staying in power. So he spends more money on war, he spends more money on domestic security, on the security of the regime, and he spends more money on propaganda. So they are not worried about the falling incomes of the Russian population. That's not a major concern.
The Russian economy is difficult to assess. For a start, there's distrust around official figures from Moscow. Another issue is the nature of the country's war economy itself.
GDP in wartime is different from GDP in peacetime. So in the wartime, I pay for a tank, then this tank is destroyed next week, and this is literally the case. Average lifetime of a tank on the battleground is several days. So this tank is destroyed. So this money has no positive impact on the quality of life of ordinary Russians. But it looks like we produce a tank worth of GDP.
As well as next year's ramped up budget, the Kremlin recently added nearly $40 billion to the budget for 2023, reflecting how much it was pumping into its war effort and raising concerns over inflationary risks in an already stretched economy. Yet any idea that the strain on the Russian economy could derail either Putin or the war effort itself looks increasingly unrealistic.
How long Russia can sustain this war, unfortunately, for an extended period of time. Because this is not just about fiscal revenues, it's also about Russia's ability to finance any kind of deficit. Right now, the country has been able to get the deficit under control for most of 2023, so it's not really a big issue at this time.
The real incomes of the Russian people has already fallen since the beginning of the war, and quite substantially, but there is still a room to go, right? The thing is that the economy, it's not something like the light, you switch it off and everything collapses. People live worse than they were living back 2 years ago, but still there is a room to their lives worsening without causing, a major socio-political change.
Russia's capacity to keep going doesn't mean that the Western alliance doesn't have options. There's little doubt that something needs to be done, and done fast.
So if he has 2 percentage points of GDP in oil and gas revenues, he will spend it on the war. If oil price goes up because, for example, events in Middle East, he'll be happy to go further. And that's his preference. And so I think tightening the sanctions to reduce amount of money Putin can spend on the war is what needs to be done.
There are things that need to be done to make sure that pressure on Russia is maintained. Otherwise, the country will earn significantly more from its oil exports going forward. And it's also a problem with the credibility of the broader sanctions regime.
The European Commission has already agreed a new round of sanctions against Russia, although the exact details have not been released. The Commission confirmed the following to DW in a statement. As President von der Leyen said recently, the new package will include new import and export bans, actions to tighten the oil price cap, and tough measures on third country companies which circumvent the sanctions. It's now up to the 27 EU member states to agree unanimously to the proposals, but there's no clear timeline on when that may happen. There have been reports that the proposals include plans for Denmark to be given the task of inspecting and potentially blocking tankers carrying Russian oil through the narrow Danish Straits. More than half of all Russia's seaborne oil exports cross the straits. It's believed that Danish authorities would target ships operating without Western insurance, based on laws to do with environmental risk.
With Russia having moved on from kind of Western insurance to other schemes, we believe that these insurance companies are actually not financially equipped to pay out in the case of an ecological disaster.
It's a genuine risk, given how old some of the tankers Russia is using are. But introducing this sanction could cut Russia's revenues.
If we require, for instance, Baltic Sea coastal states, if we require certain insurance standards, that it would also force Russia to rely again on Western maritime insurance companies, and this would mean that the leverage of the price cap system remains in place for longer.
Then there's the question of enforcement. We mentioned attestation fraud earlier. That's where paperwork is falsified to suggest ships are complying with sanctions. It's another area which needs to be tightened significantly if Russia's revenues are to be restricted. Last month, the US sanctioned 3 UAE-based shipping companies for exporting Russian oil above the price cap. Benjamin Hilgenstock says the problem is rampant, and current ways of dealing with it are nowhere near enough.
It's very difficult for enforcing authorities to investigate and to determine if a violation actually took place here. And what we're thinking about here is original sales contracts, bank transactions, related customs declarations that allow enforcing agencies to determine at what price actually this cargo was sold. Right now, you only have this attestation, which is essentially a one-page document on which someone says this was sold at price cap or below and then signs. And that is entirely inadequate.
So there's Russia itself and the various companies providing dodgy services to help it evade the price cap. But what about sanctioning the likes of China or India, who buy so much of the oil?
We should remember that nobody wants to be sanctioned by the US or Europe. This is very costly for anybody who wants to work in the global market. And so I think the Western coalition should do more of that. And remember, oil price cap is designed in such a way that it's good for Indian buyers or Chinese buyers.
In theory, it is in India's interests to pay less for Russia's oil. They could potentially tell Russia that fear of sanctions means they won't pay above the cap. But there are clear reasons why sanctions against India or China are unlikely.
Europe doesn't want to sanction China because Europe wants to play this role of a good cop, because US, you have a bipartisan consensus to be a bad cop vis-a-vis China. US doesn't want to sanction India because India is an important counterweight in the standoff between US and China. So we don't see unity within Western coalition to go this way.
In the nearly 2 years since Putin's troops poured across Ukraine's borders, the Russian economy has been hit with a wave of unprecedented sanctions. At times, its military campaign has floundered. It's been written off. But it's still going. And the huge increase in the defence budget suggests Putin still has serious means at his disposal.
With Putin in charge, with this openly repressive regime in charge, I think they will manage, as long as the economy is not in ruins, which is not the case and is not the forecast for the time being. 2% here, 5% there is not going to break the political equilibrium.
We should dispense with the notion that sanctions alone can end this war because they mean that Russia can no longer finance its war expenditures. I don't think that's realistic. Ultimately, we're also talking about a dictatorship, and if you prioritize conducting this war over everything else, then you can shift expenditures.
Given the limited battlefield progress for Ukraine recently, and doubts over continued Western support, pressure is on to show that sanctions still matter.
I don't think any of these developments or measures taken by themselves determine Russia's ability to conduct this war. It just makes it increasingly more painful, and that's why we should keep working on making sure that the energy sanctions regime remains effective.
Those who know Russia and Putin best say that no amount of financial hardship will make him stop.
The war is not going as they planned, but I think they have no doubts in their mind that they need to continue this war, and he will continue the war until his last breath.
A sobering thought for those willing Ukraine to succeed, but also a call to action to keep targeting Putin's and Russia's most powerful weapon. That's it for this episode of Business Beyond. If you found this one informative, you'll probably be interested in some of the others that we've released recently, so do check them out on our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, and until the next time, take care.